Retired rancher bought an old barn with a huge locked crate. What he found inside shocked him. Sometimes the most life-changing discoveries are hiding in plain sight. Garrett McCallum thought he was just buying an old barn on the outskirts of Millfield to store his woodworking tools and maybe start a small furniture business. 3 months after losing his wife Margaret, the 67-year-old needed something to fill the silence that had swallowed his days. But when he walked into that barn for the first time as the new owner, he found something that would consume his thoughts for weeks. Standing in the center of the weathered wooden structure was a massive steel crate, nearly 12 feet tall and just as wide, secured with heavy-duty industrial locks that looked newer than anything else in the building. The previous owner, Felix Drummond, had died 6 months earlier, and his daughter Iris had sold the property without ever mentioning this enormous mystery taking up half the barn space. Garrett circled the crate slowly, his work boots crunching on the scattered hay. The metal surface was dark gray, almost black, with no markings or labels anywhere visible. He ran his calloused hand along the smooth steel, feeling the quality of the construction. This wasn't some cheap storage container. The locks alone probably cost more than most people spent on a monthly mortgage payment. Each one was a serious piece of security hardware, the kind used to protect valuable equipment or sensitive materials. He counted 6 locks in total, positioned at different points around what appeared to be a sealed door that ran nearly the full height of the crate. Standing next to the crate, Garrett felt dwarfed by its imposing presence. He was a tall man, had been all his life, but this thing made him feel like a child. The top disappeared into the shadows of the barn's peaked roof, and he estimated it had to weigh several tons. The barn itself showed signs of recent activity, despite Felix's death. Fresh tire tracks marked the dirt floor, and the path from the main doors to the crate was worn smooth from repeated use. Someone had been coming here regularly, and recently, as the afternoon sun began to fade, casting long shadows across the barn floor, Garrett pressed his ear against the cold metal surface. The steel was thick, maybe an inch or more, but as he held his breath and listened carefully, he could swear he heard something. A faint humming, barely perceptible like electrical equipment running deep inside. He moved to different spots around the crate, pressing his ear to various points along the surface. There it was again. Not his imagination. A subtle vibration, a soft mechanical sound that suggested whatever was inside this crate was very much alive with activity. Climate control maybe, or monitoring equipment. But that raised even more disturbing questions. What needed to be kept at a specific temperature and humidity? What required constant monitoring in a locked crate hidden away in an isolated barn? As Garrett stepped back from the crate, the humming seemed to shift slightly, as if responding to his presence. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. For a long moment he stood perfectly still, listening. Then he heard it clearly, unmistakably. A soft, rhythmic clicking sound coming from somewhere inside the massive container. Click, pause, click, pause, like a timer counting down, or a signal being transmitted. The sound continued for exactly 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly, leaving only the original barely audible hum. That rhythmic clicking haunted Garrett's drive back to town, replaying in his mind like a broken record. He pulled out his cell phone and called the number Iris Drummond had given him during the sale. The phone rang 4 times before her voicemail picked up. He left a message asking her to call him back about something in the barn that hadn't been mentioned during their negotiations, but something told him she wouldn't return his call anytime soon. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by questions that multiplied faster than he could organize them. By morning, Garrett had convinced himself that the ethical thing to do was to contact the county sheriff and report the discovery. But as he sat at his kitchen table with the phone in his hand, another thought stopped him cold. What if this was exactly what Felix Drummond had intended? What if the old man had deliberately sold the barn to someone he knew would be curious enough to investigate? The idea seemed ridiculous at first, but the more Garrett considered it, the more sense it made. Felix had specifically requested that the sale go to someone local, someone who understood rural communities. He'd also insisted on a cash sale with no inspections, which had seemed like an old-fashioned quirk at the time. Now it looked like careful planning. Garrett spent the morning at the hardware store, ostensibly buying supplies for his woodworking hobby, but really studying the selection of bolt cutters and angle grinders. The store owner, Vernon Karras, had known Felix for 40 years and seemed eager to talk about his old friend's final months. "Strange thing about Felix," Vernon said, leaning across the counter. Man lived alone for 15 years after his wife passed, hardly talked to anybody except when he needed supplies. But these last few months before he died, he was in here almost weekly, buying the oddest combination of things. Industrial chains, heavy-duty padlocks, battery-powered winches, enough dried goods to feed a small army. Vernon glanced around the empty store before continuing. Asked me once if I knew anyone trustworthy who might be interested in buying his barn. Not the house, mind you, just the barn. Said he needed someone who understood that some things are better left undisturbed until the right person comes along. I told him he was talking in riddles, and he just smiled and said I'd understand someday. Vernon fixed Garrett with a meaningful look. Heard you bought that place. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. Garrett bought his supplies and left without confirming anything, but his hands were shaking slightly as he loaded the angle grinder into his truck. Whatever was in that crate had been Felix's responsibility, and now that burden had been deliberately passed to him. Back at the barn an hour later, Garrett stood before the massive crate with the angle grinder in his hands. The afternoon light streaming through the barn walls illuminated the steel surface, making the locks gleam like sentinels. He could hear that faint humming again, constant and patient. Whatever was inside had been waiting a long time. He positioned the cutting disc against the first lock, the heavy industrial padlock that secured the main latch. His finger hovered over the trigger. One squeeze, and there would be no going back. The grinder would cut through the hardened steel in seconds, and whatever secret Felix had protected would be his responsibility. Garrett pressed the trigger. The angle grinder roared to life, and sparks exploded from the contact point between disc and lock. The shower of bright orange sparks lit up the dim barn interior like fireworks, and the high-pitched scream of metal on metal echoed off the walls. But just as the disc began to bite into the lock mechanism, Garrett released the trigger and stepped back. Vernon's words echoed in his memory. Some things are better left undisturbed until the right person comes along. The decision to stop cutting haunted Garrett for the rest of that evening, but something deep in his gut told him he'd made the right choice. The next morning, he returned to the barn with a different approach. If he couldn't open the crate yet, maybe he could understand what he was dealing with by examining the building itself more carefully. Starting at the main entrance, Garrett began a methodical search of every corner, every beam, every section of wall he might have missed during his initial inspection. Behind a stack of hay bales in the far corner, he discovered something that made his pulse quicken. A metal file cabinet, old but well-maintained, sat partially hidden from view. The bottom drawer slid open easily, revealing neat folders filled with handwritten records in Felix's careful script. The documents showed monthly deliveries spanning 20 years, all scheduled for the third Saturday of each month. Morrison Transport Company, based 200 miles away in the state capital. Each delivery had been received and signed for personally by Felix. But what struck Garrett was the pattern. The deliveries had never missed a month, not once in 2 decades, until they stopped abruptly 6 months ago, right around the time Felix died. As he studied the delivery records, Garrett noticed something odd about the barn's lighting. For an old agricultural building, it seemed unusually bright during the day, even with the doors closed. He walked the perimeter, looking up at the walls and ceiling with new eyes. There, nearly invisible among the weathered wooden beams, he spotted discreet vents and what looked like LED light strips hidden behind false panels. Following his instincts, Garrett began running his hands along the walls, pressing and probing. About 10 feet from the crate, his fingers found a section of wall that felt different. When he pushed against it, a panel swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a sophisticated electrical control system that had no business existing in a rural barn. Digital displays showed temperature readings, humidity levels, power consumption, and something labeled containment status, stable, in green letters. The complexity of the hidden infrastructure was staggering. This wasn't just a barn with a storage container. This was a monitoring station designed to maintain precise environmental conditions. Garrett studied the various switches and displays, afraid to touch anything that might disrupt whatever delicate balance was being maintained. A soft chime from the control panel made him jump. One of the displays had changed from green to yellow, and new text appeared. Proximity alert. Unauthorized personnel detected. Garrett backed away from the panel immediately, his heart racing. The system was watching him, recording his presence, probably transmitting data to someone somewhere. As if responding to his movement, the humming sound from inside the crate grew slightly louder, and he could hear what sounded like mechanical adjustments taking place. Cooling fans spinning up, pumps cycling, equipment making minute calibrations. Whatever was inside that container was very much alive and responding to changes in its environment. Garrett closed the hidden panel and stepped back toward the center of the barn. The crate loomed before him, no longer just a mystery, but clearly a sophisticated piece of equipment designed for long-term storage of something that required constant monitoring and environmental control. The industrial locks weren't just keeping people out. They were keeping something in that needed very specific conditions to remain stable. As he stood there processing this realization, his phone buzzed with an incoming text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Tonight. Come alone." There was no signature, no identification, just an address he didn't recognize and a time, 8 p.m. The next morning, Garrett called the number listed on the Department of Agriculture letterhead. After being transferred through 4 different departments, he finally reached someone who claimed to know about the Strategic Reserve Program. The woman's voice was professional but cautious, and she asked several questions about his identity and relationship to Felix Drummond before saying anything substantial. "Mr. McCallum, we've been expecting your call. Felix Drummond informed us before his passing that you would be taking over custodial responsibilities for the facility. However, there are protocols that must be followed before we can discuss the nature of the stored materials. We'll need to arrange for a security clearance review and background verification. This process typically takes 6 to 8 weeks. Garrett felt his frustration building. "Ma'am, I bought a barn. I didn't sign up to be part of any government program. I just want to know what's in the crate so I can decide whether to keep it or have it removed." There was a long pause before the woman responded. "Mr. McCallum, I'm afraid removal isn't an option. The materials stored at your facility are classified as critical national resources. The custodial agreement transfers automatically with property ownership, as outlined in the deed restrictions. You should have received a copy of these documents from your attorney during the sale." After hanging up, Garrett immediately called the lawyer who had handled the property transaction. The man seemed uncomfortable when Garrett mentioned the government program and asked him to hold while he retrieved the file. When he came back on the line, his tone had changed completely. "Garrett, I need to be honest with you. There were some unusual clauses in the deed that I didn't fully understand at the time. Felix insisted on them, and his daughter seemed eager to get the property sold quickly. The language refers to existing federal agreements that transfer with ownership. I assumed it was some kind of agricultural subsidy program. I should have investigated more thoroughly." The lawyer agreed to overnight copies of all the paperwork, but Garrett's patience was wearing thin. He drove back to the barn that afternoon with a new determination to find answers on his own. The crate seemed to loom larger each time he saw it, and the climate control system hummed quietly in the background like some kind of technological heartbeat. As he stood there studying the locks again, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was male, older, with a slight accent he couldn't identify. "Mr. McCallum? My name is Dr. Harrison Webb. I understand you've inherited Felix Drummond's responsibilities. I was hoping we might arrange a meeting to discuss the transition. There are things about the program that can't be explained over the phone, and frankly, things that Felix should have prepared you for before his death." The man's tone was urgent, but not threatening. He explained that he had been Felix's primary contact for the program and had been trying to arrange a handover meeting for months. Felix had assured him that Garrett was trustworthy and would understand the importance of the work, but had died before any proper introduction could be made. "I can be at your location tomorrow evening if that works for you. This conversation needs to happen face to face, and there are some security considerations we need to discuss. The materials in that crate represent years of careful preparation, and there are people who would go to considerable lengths to access them." After agreeing to the meeting, Garrett spent the rest of the day wondering what he had gotten himself into. The simple purchase of an old barn had somehow made him a guardian of classified government resources that someone apparently considered worth stealing. The address led Garrett to a truck stop diner 20 miles outside of town, the kind of place where long-haul drivers grabbed coffee and meals at all hours. At exactly 8 p.m., he sat in a back booth nursing a cup of coffee that had grown cold while he waited. The man who approached his table looked nothing like what Garrett had expected. Dr. Harrison Webb was in his 70s, wearing a simple flannel shirt and worn jeans that made him blend in perfectly with the other customers. Only his eyes gave him away, sharp and calculating behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. McCallum, thank you for coming. I apologize for the cloak and dagger routine, but there are people who monitor government communications, and this conversation needs to happen off the record. Webb slid into the booth across from him and immediately lowered his voice. Felix Drummond was supposed to prepare you for this transition, but his heart attack came sooner than anyone expected. That leaves us with a problem. Webb pulled out a leather folder and set it on the table between them. What I'm about to tell you is classified, but you're already involved whether you understand it or not. That crate in your barn contains genetic material from heritage seed varieties that no longer exist in commercial agriculture. We're talking about genetic diversity that could mean the difference between food security and famine if our current crop systems fail. Garrett felt his stomach drop. You're telling me I'm sitting on some kind of national seed bank? Not just any seed bank. These varieties were collected over 70 years ago, before industrial agriculture eliminated them from general use. Some of these plants can survive droughts that would kill modern hybrid crops. Others are resistant to diseases that could wipe out entire harvests. The Department of Agriculture has been maintaining strategic reserves in locations like yours for decades, places that aren't obvious targets, but have the infrastructure to keep the materials viable. Webb opened the folder and showed Garrett photographs of sophisticated storage systems. The container is actually a cryogenic preservation unit. The seeds are kept at precisely -20 degrees Celsius, with backup power systems and redundant monitoring. Felix was one of 12 custodians nationwide, and he took the responsibility very seriously. The implications hit Garrett like a physical blow. What happens if something goes wrong? What if the power fails or the cooling system breaks down? 70 years of irreplaceable genetic heritage dies in a matter of hours. That's why we need someone on site at all times. Someone who understands the systems and can respond to emergencies. Felix was trained for 6 months before he took over from the previous custodian. We don't have that luxury of time with you. Webb reached into his jacket and pulled out a smartphone with a black case. This device connects directly to the monitoring systems in your barn. It will alert you to any problems with temperature, humidity, power, or security. More importantly, it will tell you if anyone tries to access the container without proper authorization. As if summoned by his words, the phone in Webb's hand began vibrating with an incoming alert. Both men looked down at the screen, which displayed a red warning message. Perimeter breach detected. Unauthorized vehicle approaching. Below that, a timestamp showed the alert was happening right now. Webb's face went pale as he looked at Garrett. Someone is at your barn, right now, and they're not supposed to be there. He stood up quickly, leaving money on the table. We need to get there immediately. But we can't go together. Take the back roads, stay off the main highway, and whatever you do, don't call the police. Some of the people who want access to that genetic material have resources that extend far beyond what local law enforcement can handle. As Garrett hurried toward his truck, Webb called out one final warning that sent chills down his spine. If they've managed to open that container, we may already be too late to stop them. Garrett took the long way back to his property, driving without headlights for the last quarter mile, and parking his truck behind a cluster of oak trees 100 yards from the barn. The building looked normal from the outside, but as he approached on foot, he could see that the main doors were standing slightly open. He was certain he'd locked them securely before leaving for the diner. Moving carefully along the side of the barn, Garrett peered through a gap between the wooden slats. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 figures in dark clothing were clustered around the massive crate, and they had brought professional equipment. Cutting torches, battery-powered angle grinders, and what looked like a portable hydraulic jack designed to force locks. One of them was already working on the bottom lock with a high-powered torch, sending showers of sparks across the barn floor. The men moved with practiced efficiency, clearly experienced at breaking into secure containers. But what worried Garrett most was their casual attitude toward the sophisticated monitoring systems he'd discovered earlier. Either they didn't know about the hidden electronics, or they had ways to disable them that he couldn't see. From his hiding spot, Garrett could hear fragments of their conversation over the noise of the cutting equipment. The man with the torch was speaking to someone on a radio headset, reporting their progress to a person he called Control. The operation was being coordinated by people who weren't even on site, which suggested resources far beyond a simple theft. As the first lock gave way under the intense heat of the cutting torch, Garrett felt panic rising in his chest. Webb had been clear about the consequences if the container's seal was broken without proper procedures. 70 years of irreplaceable genetic material would be destroyed within hours if the internal environment was compromised. These people might not even know what they were destroying, in their rush to access what they thought was valuable. Garrett pulled out the smartphone Webb had given him and saw multiple red alerts filling the screen. Temperature fluctuations, security breaches, power irregularities. The container's internal systems were already responding to the external damage, trying to compensate for the breach in security. But each alert message included the same warning: container integrity compromised. Emergency protocols required. The second lock fell to the cutting tools, and Garrett could see the men preparing to tackle the remaining 4. They worked in shifts, one person cutting while the others cooled the equipment and cleared away debris. At their current pace, they would have the container open within an hour. Making a decision that could save or doom the genetic material inside, Garrett began circling around to the back of the barn. The building's electrical service entered through a weathered gray meter box attached to the rear wall. If he could cut power to the barn entirely, the cooling systems would switch to backup batteries. But more importantly, the container might have security protocols that would prevent it from opening during a power emergency. As he reached for the main electrical disconnect, Garrett heard the sound of vehicles approaching on the gravel road. Multiple engines, moving fast and without headlights. Someone else had detected the break-in, and they were coming in force. What had started as a simple theft was about to become something much more dangerous. The smartphone in his hand buzzed with an urgent message from Webb. Emergency response team en route. Stay hidden. Do not engage intruders. If container opens before team arrives, genetic material lost forever. Garrett looked back toward the barn where the cutting torches continued their work on the massive locks. The next few minutes would determine whether 70 years of irreplaceable agricultural heritage survived or died in a remote barn in the middle of nowhere. Garrett's hand was on the electrical disconnect when the approaching vehicles suddenly cut their engines about a quarter-mile away. The sudden silence was more frightening than the noise had been, because it meant both groups were now moving on foot in complete darkness. Professional teams coordinating a tactical approach to his barn, while he crouched behind the building like a trespasser on his own property. Inside the barn, the cutting had stopped as well. The intruders had heard the vehicles and were now discussing their options in hushed, urgent voices. Through the gap in the wooden slats, Garrett could see them gathering their equipment and preparing to either fight or flee. One of them was speaking rapidly into his radio headset, but the responses he was getting clearly weren't what he wanted to hear. The smartphone in Garrett's hand vibrated with a text message from Webb. Response team in position. Container status critical. 4 locks breached, 2 remaining. If they complete the breach, emergency venting will destroy all samples within 30 minutes. Cannot prevent this remotely. Looking back at the barn, Garrett could see the massive container more clearly now. The intruders had set up portable lighting that illuminated their work area, and he could see that they had indeed cut through 4 of the 6 locks. The container's door was actually beginning to bow outward slightly, as if internal pressure was building up behind the sealed entrance. Whatever emergency protocols Webb had mentioned were already starting to activate. The decision that came to Garrett in that moment surprised him with its clarity. These weren't just seeds in a container. This was 70 years of agricultural knowledge that could feed people during famines, resist diseases that might wipe out modern crops, and survive climate changes that would kill current food systems. Felix Drummond had understood that responsibility and had carried it faithfully until his death. Now it was Garrett's turn. Moving as quietly as possible, Garrett circled back toward the front of the barn. The intruders were focused on the approaching response team, and their attention was turned away from the main entrance. If he could get inside and reach the hidden control panel, maybe he could activate some kind of lockdown protocol that would prevent the container from opening completely. As he slipped through the partially open barn doors, Garrett could hear voices outside approaching from multiple directions. The response team Webb had mentioned was moving into position, surrounding the building, but they were still several minutes away from being able to intervene directly, and the intruders were working frantically to finish cutting the remaining locks before they were forced to abandon their operation. Garrett reached the hidden control panel and quickly opened it, revealing the digital displays he had seen earlier. The screen now showed multiple red warnings: container integrity compromised, emergency venting sequence initiated, and most alarming of all, genetic material viability declining. Below those warnings was a single option flashing in white letters: manual override available, authorized personnel only. Without hesitation, Garrett pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner beside the screen, not expecting it to work, but hoping Felix had somehow arranged for the transfer of access. To his amazement, the scanner beeped once and displayed, "Access granted. Welcome, Custodian McCallum." Felix had indeed planned ahead, registering Garrett's biometric data during the property sale process through methods he could only guess at. The control system offered him a choice that would determine everything: initiate emergency lockdown or allow manual access. If he chose lockdown, the container would seal completely and the genetic material would be safe, but the intruders would escape and probably try again. If he chose manual access, he could open the container himself and prevent the emergency venting, but he would have to trust that the response team would arrive in time to secure the samples. Garrett chose manual access, and immediately the control panel began displaying new options. He could override the emergency venting sequence, but only if he opened the container within the next 8 minutes. The system was designed to protect the genetic material from contamination, but it would destroy everything rather than allow unauthorized access. It was a safeguard that could save or doom 70 years of irreplaceable agricultural heritage. The sound of boots running across the barn floor made him turn around. The 3 intruders had spotted him at the control panel and were advancing rapidly, abandoning their cutting equipment in favor of speed. But they had miscalculated the timing. As they reached the center of the barn, the main doors burst open, and a tactical response team flooded inside, weapons drawn and flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Federal agents, nobody move." The lead agent's voice echoed through the barn as the intruders found themselves surrounded. The standoff lasted only seconds before the would-be thieves dropped their tools and raised their hands in surrender. They had been professionals, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered by people who had been planning for this possibility for years. Webb appeared behind the tactical team, moving directly to where Garrett stood at the control panel. "The container, Garrett. You need to open it now, or the emergency protocols will destroy everything inside." His voice carried decades of knowledge about what was at stake, and Garrett could see genuine fear in the older man's eyes. With the intruders secured, Garrett turned back to the control panel and initiated the manual access sequence. The massive container responded with a soft hiss as internal pressure equalized, and then the enormous door began to swing open on hidden hinges. What Garrett saw inside took his breath away. The interior of the container was like stepping into a science laboratory from the future. Thousands of sealed glass vials lined the walls in temperature-controlled racks, each one labeled with coordinates and dates going back decades. This wasn't just a collection of seeds. It was a comprehensive genetic library of food crops that had been systematically gathered from around the world before industrial agriculture eliminated them forever. Webb moved past him into the container, checking digital displays and taking readings with handheld instruments. Temperature stable, humidity perfect, genetic viability at optimal levels. You saved it all. "Garrett, every single sample is intact." He turned back to face him with something approaching reverence. "These seeds represent genetic diversity that could feed the world if our current food systems fail. You're not just storing seeds, you're protecting humanity's future." 6 months later, Garrett McCallum had become someone he never expected to be, the custodian of a genetic vault that operated in the shadows of government programs most people would never hear about. He had learned to read the monitoring systems, respond to alerts, and coordinate with researchers who came monthly to access specific samples for crucial agricultural projects. The loneliness that had consumed him after Margaret's death had been replaced by a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. He wasn't just surviving his retirement. He was protecting resources that could prevent famines, resist climate change, and ensure that future generations would have the genetic tools needed to grow food in an uncertain world. Every morning, Garrett walked into that barn knowing he was the guardian of something irreplaceable. Felix Drummond had chosen well when he selected him as a successor. Some responsibilities were too important to be carried alone, but some people were strong enough to carry them anyway. If you enjoyed this incredible discovery, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western story where secrets buried in the past change everything. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more amazing stories like this one. Your support means the world to us.